Is the video about Byron Bay winter. So feel free throughout this to stop, to go over it, to make notes and annotations on your poem. I'm following this sort of precedent set by Miss Green, where the annotations will get less and less on the screen, and you'll have to listen to what I am saying to provide the annotations, to write that down. And the aim of that is obviously for you to develop your own interpretation and your own ability to articulate and express your thoughts in a coherent manner. I just want to say that these interpretations and comments aren't obviously Bible, so to speak, that they are just an interpretation and one interpretation of the poem, because as you know, Gray wants the responder to take from his imagery and from his poems what they need and what they want, what has meaning for them. So let's start with this. Now, I do want to first off say that you need to make sure you're using the right additional version. I'll take accountability here. So when I put in the copy that I know my class has of the poems, I found them on the internet. Now, you may have, which was the correct, accurate editions at the time. You may be aware that Robert Gray actually has changed his poems because he's a poet that so much cares about the word choice and wants to capture that experience and communicate the experience he wants. He has, at later dates, made edits. So the actual version of Byron Bay you need to be looking at for the one for the HSC is the 4-stanza version. So the one that was originally on the Google Doc, I've gone in and changed it, is actually the 6-stanza version. And this is an interesting exercise, not that you need to compare the two, but by looking at the comparisons, you'll be able to think, well, what changes were made and what does he want to focus on? And that might help you decide what resonates and what aspects of the poem are most important. So look at this challenge as an opportunity. Sorry for any confusion, but the 4-stanza Byron Bay Winter version is the one that we want to look at, because that's the one that the prescribed text list needs you to use from 2014 Coast Road. So let's get started. Byron Bay Winter. Now I've got here that you've got the physical setting dictated by Byron Bay, and then you've got the colon and then winter. Winter then being the temporal setting, or the time that this is occurring. Winter is also a season, so it brings up connotations of the cyclical nature of life. Winter is also defined in part by its connection to spring, so the idea of renewal. So here in winter, we are in a moment where things have slowed, things tend to get colder, but also provide an opportunity for people to take stock. So you've got Byron Bay Winter. The colon that's in pink there, now a colon is very much an important piece of punctuation. He could have used a comma, he didn't. He could easily have had no punctuation, but by doing that, he very clearly sets up a connection between the two. So a colon may be used, as it says, instead of a semicolon, which is not there, between independent clauses when the second sentence explains, illustrates, paraphrases, or expands on the first sentence. Now, obviously, this is a word and this is a word. They're not sentences, but the use of the colon is the same. He very clearly wants to set up a connection between winter and Byron Bay. And I think that comes down as well to the part that the colon, for me at least, brings up the idea that's almost setting the scene like a play or a movie, or he's telling a story. So the scene is Byron Bay, winter, and then the action of the poem takes place. Now, the first stanza, I'll just read it for you. Barely contained by the eyesight, the beach is one great arc, their overlap behind it, blue ranges, each a tide mark. Beautiful rhythm there, and as you can see, the structure, this is a quatrain. The poem is 4 quatrains, and it's A-B couplets, and it is a half rhyme. So eyesight and it don't quite rhyme, but arc and mark do. And so again, the whole poem is written in that half rhyme. As we know from Harbour Dusk, he considers it almost a loose structure. But let's get down to the nitty gritty. So barely contained. I've got that. The colours here don't mean anything specifically. They're more just to draw your attention to certain parts. So this yellow, barely contained. I've got the idea that the word choice here, the adverb and the verb combination, underlines the magnitude of nature and man's ability to truly comprehend it. Because if something's contained, it's contained. So the only reason he points out that it's barely contained is to give this sense that perhaps it's a struggle, or perhaps it's only just managed it. To set up the scope of nature and the scope of the experience, it is barely contained. The word eyesight has connotations of seeing and vision. Obviously, it's the physical faculty by which mankind sees the world, and for Gray as an imagist, that's very important. But it is almost like asking, is it the act of seeing or understanding that seeing gives us that allows man to comprehend their experience of nature? Now, there's a corollary, or a sort of connection between the physical vision and the metaphysical vision. So between seeing something physically and seeing something as an understanding. And I think that's further emphasized by the use of the eyesight, which is a definite article, which universalizes that word. So it's not just the persona's eyesight, it's eyesight in general. And it's saying, is our ability to see things, even if barely containing it, is that what lets us understand it? Now, the focus of that is the beach. The beach is one great arc. I've highlighted here that one has connotations of unity and wholeness. Now, it's interesting to note that in the version that I had put up originally, or in the prior to the 2014 version, the word one isn't there. Okay, it actually is the beach makes one great arc, like the idea that nature is creating something. But here it's saying it is one great arc. So is nature a vehicle for wholeness? It's a question that perhaps that raises. There, overlap behind it, blue ranges, each a tide mark. I could have commented on the word there, which implies something separate to where the persona is, so distance, but let's not focus on that. What I do want to focus on is the idea that each of these underlined words, contained, arc, overlap, ranges, and mark, all develop the idea of boundaries of limits. Okay, and that I think throughout the poem there is this tension between what we can as men and as people see and understand, where two worlds collide, where two worlds meet, where two states meet, is happening throughout the poem, and these underlined words develop those ideas there. Contained, arc, overlap, ranges, and mark. Now this stanza ends in a metaphor, each a tide mark. So the mountains are compared to the edges of where the ocean reaches on the sand. Now, he's there comparing the mountains or the blue ranges to that, and that to me brings up the question, are the mountains the lines where the earth reaches on the sky? So you have this meeting of two worlds, land and sea, and then land and sky. And the word blue, which he uses to describe those mountains, he doesn't say mountains, he says blue ranges. One, it's his colour motif, which he uses throughout all his poetry, but it strengthens the metaphor. It connects the mountains to the oceans. Blue also reflecting the Australian landscape because it is our eucalypts which give them that blue haze. Now this word ranges, I've highlighted again or pointed to it in terms of it's an ambiguous choice of words. He could have said blue mountains, he could have said blue hills, he said ranges. One, it's a nice, it supports the flow and the sound of his poetry, which is an important consideration, but I think it also has a sense of ambiguity which Gray wants to use. Ranges also means the distances within which a person can see or hear. So the range of pitch, the range of eyesight. So again, it has that connection to this idea of, is it our experiences in nature that allow us to understand ourselves and the world, and to what extent does our ability to see or to experience it impact our ability to understand or truly connect with nature. And just one more point here, tide, which is there, connotes, again, that idea of cycles, of time, of movement, which the winter at the beginning brings up. Second stanza. Beside me, swamp oaks foliage, streams hatching by Cezanne. Out on the heath, a guard's carriage follows the vats of a train. Now this again is half rhyme, which is every single one of his stanzas, but let's have a look here. The preposition beside me gets up a sense of closeness and connection. It's a physical proximity within which the persona, highlighted by the personal pronoun me, denotes that relationship. It's not away from me, it's next to me, it's beside me. So he is very much in nature, the persona. The idea of the swamp oaks, which is a tree, and its foliage, which are its leaves, streaming, is a metaphor. So again, he's connecting the tree, or the leaves of the trees, to this idea of streams. So a metaphor connecting the tree and water, which I think is a very interesting motif or choice by Gray, given that a lot of what this poem is doing is looking at water or using water to create some effect there. And again, I think it blurs that idea of connection between land and sea. Now he calls it hatching by Cezanne. This is another metaphor. Cezanne is an impressionist painter, and hatching is a technique that he used. So what he's saying there is that the physical, visual impression of these swamp oaks looks like the hatching by Cezanne. Now I've got here the idea of it's a metaphor, nature as a painting. So Cezanne is a painter and he captured what he saw, and now he's saying and using that metaphor of a painting to capture what he's seeing. Now that ties into the first stanza where it says barely contained by the eyesight, because here he is directly saying that this is something, a painting, which is something captured by the human eye. I've got here as a different sense of there's a juxtaposition in this sentence and this sentence, which both sentences make up the stanza. You've got this juxtaposition of the function of two functions of man. So man can create art, and he uses that by describing nature as art, but also man can also think of things as being a utility, as being something of industry. And that's expressed in that second line with the idea of trains, guards, carriages. So in these two-line sentences, you've got that juxtaposition which could call into question or ask or suggest things about what does man do and the experience of man. In the second stanza more specifically, out on the heath, the preposition here is a contrast to the first one, which is close to the persona. This one's further away. This is out on the heath. So it sets up the relationship. Now, the word choice of heath is also interesting because heath tends to be a word which describes a wilderness. So you've got this sense of untouched land, and out on that untouched land, there is the train. So there's that juxtaposition here in this these two lines between the man-made, the train, and the natural, the heath. And I think this juxtaposition of man and nature is something that Gray does throughout the whole poem. This last point here, I've highlighted that hatching, and I've underlined it here, is again one of those words like ranges which has ambiguous kind of tone or impression or meaning. Hatching, one being the technique by which Cezanne painted, but also that idea of hatching of an egg, of birth, and that's brings up interesting ideas when you're thinking about winter coming before spring and the idea of cycles. So hatching sort of reinforces that. It's interesting that it's in a present continuous tense. So it's something that's always happening. So this nature is always in a process of hatching, so to speak. And then if man, as Cezanne, is the one doing that, capturing that, is there a connection between man and nature that is ongoing, that is continuous, that is life-giving? The third stanza, beyond. Cloudy afternoon swells, the colour of claret stain. The sunlit town strewn like petals, its lighthouse a tiny pawn. Again, half rhyme, but this is where all of them are half rhyme. This is something, again, that was changed and edited in the first version of the poem that I put up it was strewn like shells. So I think it's even more important. If the 2014 he wanted to make it petals, what does that mean and what's he trying to say? Again, we're not comparing the two poems, but pay attention to petals because it obviously is something that he wants to communicate. But let's go from the beginning of the stanza. Beyond is a preposition again. It goes further than out on the heath. This is beyond the persona. It has connotations of transcendence, which you probably remember from SOR, Studies of Religion. And the question or the ambiguity here, is it beyond the place? Is it beyond the beach? Or is it beyond the persona? So what actually is the thing that is experiencing this beyondness? So these cloudy afternoon swells, what is it beyond? The beach, the persona, etc. But either way, it ties up this sense of transcendence and of moving forward of time. Now I've got here cloudy afternoon swells. Clouds are a motif, clouds and smoke are a motif in Gray's work. Clouds tend to be intangible or ephemeral. Take that how you will, but think about what he might be saying about nature if he keeps describing it as using those terminology. Is it something that is fixed or is it something that is mutable or changeable? I've got here, there's a juxtaposition of light and shadow. So you've got the cloudy afternoon swells, and then in the very next line, you've got the sunlit town. So it is both lit and light, and it is both cloudy. And it's that tension between two things, which is characteristic of this poem. We've already had man-made paintings versus the natural world. We've had the idea of sea versus sky, earth versus water. The beach itself, gentlemen, is a place of transition. It is where two worlds meet. So it's very important here that the whole setting of the poem supports that idea. But I just digressed, and let's continue. So these cloudy afternoon swells, or this water here, is the colour of claret stain. Now claret is wine, so there's a metaphor here, and this interesting idea of stain. The word choice is something that I want you to think about in terms of what does that maybe imply or suggest about the impact of man on nature? Something to ponder. It could just be that the idea that it is the sun and the redness of the sun, or the claretness that comes from the clouds being there that make it red. So that might be where the word stain's coming from. It could be both. You need to be able to articulate your understanding. Now the sunlit town's strewn like petals. Or the sunlit town is strewn like petals. Remember, this apostrophe S here means can also mean town is, rather than the strewn like petals belong to the town. So I read this as the sunlit town is strewn like petals. Petals, the simile here is comparing the town as the way it looks in terms of along the scattered along the beach, but also petals are parts of a flower. So he's using the parts of a whole to describe the way the town looks. And then its lighthouse, so he's focusing in on the town itself, is a tiny pawn, a metaphor here. Now, I think this is interesting. The pawn itself can be considered to be just a visual imagery. It looks like a pawn. The lighthouse, its silhouette would look pawn-like. But are there also connotations there of lack of control or lack of agency, as a pawn is something who is under the control of a queen or of another power? And if he's using that pawn to have that connotation, then the question is the town and what it represents in terms of man. Is it saying that it has no power against nature? Something to think about there. But what I liked about strewn like petals to describe the town, and the pawn to describe the lighthouse, and then the wine to describe the cloudy afternoon swells, is this interchange. So in the first stanza, you've got a metaphor where Gray is using a man-made item, wine, to describe nature. But then here he's using a man-made item, the town, he's using nature to describe it. So there's like a reciprocal relationship, for better or worse, it is set up. Here, the man-made is used to describe nature, and here nature is used to describe the man-made. Just an odd kind of, I think, purposeful choice, and what that sets up has implications for the relationship between man and nature. Is he saying that it's completely intertwined, that it cannot be escaped, that it's inextricable and cannot be unentangled? And then what is the effect of that relationship? What are the impacts? What are the values we should or shouldn't have as a result? Last stanza. As you can see, I've just got some colours here. Again, the colours don't mean anything specific. They're just different things that you need to pay attention to. So, half rhyme, earth and warmth. The first thing I've got highlighted here is this green element, I turn. Now, I turn, I think this is very important because it's the first time that the persona has speaking in the active voice, saying I turn. It's a physical movement, but as you can see by the comma and the rest of the phrase, there is almost a conditional part, which is why I put this in yellow. When far off. This when is an adverb which adjusts or gives meaning to the turning, and it's conditional. So it almost gives a sense that he only turns when he is far away. So these prepositions here imply a sense of journey and the sense of the walking along the beach. So when far off is when I turn. Turning has connotations as a verb of cycles, but also of looking back. So it automatically sets up the image that the persona has walked through nature, having these experiences. There's been this constant connection between a use of man-made elements and natural elements and the tension between those, and that as a result he's gotten to the end and he's turning when he's far away, and as a result is looking back. So it's a moment of reflection, but there's almost the implication that it's conditional on actually going on a journey, so to speak. The sun brings, should have a capital T there, I apologise. The sun brings because it's perfect warmth, the feeling that I wear great wings while stepping along the earth. I think this is a very interesting sentence, and it's changed a lot from the first version. But let's first off talk about what hasn't changed. The sun brings because it's perfect warmth. In both, there is always this idea that the sun is bringing the warmth, so there's almost that personification of the sun or the impact of the sun on the persona. I do want to point out here that this when you follow the punctuation rules, says it is. So the sun brings because it is perfect warmth. The feeling that I wear great wings while stepping along the earth. This is something that the persona only feels as a result of being out in nature and is almost bestowed upon by the sun's perfect warmth. There is automatically that contrast between the warmth here versus the cold of winter, Byron Bay winter. So there's that juxtaposition there. The start of the poem with the title versus the end with the warmth is an interesting tension that I think you can sort of think about there. What I've got here in terms of the brings, the feeling, and the wings is this use of rhyme in bring, feeling, and wing, just connects the impact and this relationship that the wings that he feels as a result that he's wearing them is only, and the feeling of it is because of the sun. Okay? I've got perfect and wear in orange highlighted because I want to stress there's a connection between this feeling that he wears great wings as a result of the perfection. Now, if it's something that's been given to him by the sun and he's wearing it, it's something that can be taken away. It's not, I have great wings, it's I wear great wings. So like clothing, when we wear it, it's something that can be taken off. So there's this sense of impermanence to this feeling, and it's in this moment, which is again supported by the present tense. It's in this moment that the persona feels this transcendence these wings that are occurring. I've highlighted the word while because, again, this is almost conditional. So he only feels this while stepping along the earth, while going on this walk, while engaging in nature. But what's interesting here is that throughout the poem, you've had sort of the blending of two worlds. The beach itself, as I've said, is where water or the earth and water meet, land and sea. You've had the tension between sea and sky. You've had the tension between land and sky, land and sea. You've had the tension between spring or new life through the hatching and winter. You've got the tension between warmth and cold. There are all these different tensions. And here now, in this last image, you get this tension that is almost the persona who is the connection between the sun and the earth. He is now the connection between that through the wings and the warmth that he is wearing. There are some readings out there that would suggest maybe that he's like, this is a connotation in terms of wings to a Pegasus story. Robert Gray himself says it might be like an angel, and that he's sort of making the comparison that there's an angelic kind of component to this, that those wings kind of give him. But whether it's the angel or the Pegasus, the wings themselves have connotations of freedom of movement. And I think what this really is talking about is the transcendence that the persona or that man can have that through nature, through being at the end of the journey, because I turn and I'm far off. So at the end, after this journey, he has a moment of transcendence in nature that makes him feel like he bridges the gap literally between man and nature, between earth and sky. The man becomes the nexus, or the persona becomes the nexus and the meeting point that unifies everything. That's just my interpretation of that. Now, probably as this has gone on, the annotations got a bit more rambling, just purely because it's something that is living in my brain and that I constantly am working on, and that you should be as well. But also, as you've noticed or seen, the annotations have gone from being prescriptive to just being colours on a page. So hopefully you've been able to understand that. If you need to, just stop, rewind, ask me questions, ask your teachers questions. Miss Green and Miss Hutterson may disagree in parts, and that's perfectly fine. Poetry and English is all about interpretation and being able to justify it. What I do want to move on to, though, is just two things that I think are structural elements that happen throughout the whole poem. I think tense here is incredibly important, and it's present tense. This version of the poem, which goes from 6 stanzas to 4, has actually emphasised the fact that this is something happening in the present tense. Now, I think this suggests that Gray wants to emphasise that experiences, especially in nature, in the here and now, are important. Now, Gray might be saying that this allows a sense of connection and or reflection of the individual's relationship with the world. So Gray is stressing there that in being present is the chance that we can transcend, that we can reflect, that we can feel a connection and recognise those connections. I've spoken a lot about there being a tension between two states in this whole poem, and I think that's something that's in Harbour Dusk as well. But you've got this sense of earth and sky, earth and water, the beach, land and sea, man and nature, art versus function. So I think that the half rhyme really emphasises or supports this, because the tension between resolution and non-resolution, or between rhyme and only half rhyme, kind of reflects man's relationships with nature. And I think it's asking, can man's relationship with nature be completely harmonious, resolved, or perfect? And maybe it's even suggesting that the limits of our eyesight, that are only able to barely contain nature, is why it is only ever a loose half rhyme rather than full rhyme. Remembering that rhyme has sort of sense of sort of unison, completion, and wholeness. Just 3 questions to think about. 1, Gray explores a lot of tensions in his poem. I've said this already: sea and land, alone and connected, natural and man-made, contained and boundless, earth and sky, spiritual or the ephemeral, and the physical, warmth and cold. So what do you think, or what comment does this make about the individual experience of people, or individual or experience in general? 2, the metaphor of the landscape as a tide mark is presented in the final line of stanza 1. What is the commentary being made about time, endurance, nature, and human experience? Think about the power of tides, what tides do, and how they reshape land forms. And 3, generally this could be sort of a supersteel. How does Gray invite responders to reflect on the power of nature? Now remember that nature isn't only just the physical world, nature is those things which are not made by man. So time is a part of it, life and death is a part of it, not just the physical trees, etc. All right, thanks Year 12. Hopefully this made sense. Hopefully it challenged you to think. Remember, these shouldn't be the only annotations you make. There's probably many, many more I didn't speak about, but hopefully this is a start. Next thing would be to write, and as always, make good choices.